I am just so humbled and so grateful to the citizens of Fulton County who made this possible. And it's a message that's pissing folks off, but there is no one above the law in this country, nor is there anyone beneath it.
Last night, voters hit the polls in Oregon, Georgia, Kentucky, and Idaho, while Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who was prosecuting Trump in his Georgia election interference case, won her Democratic primary. Progressives had a tougher night in Oregon after Multnomah County District Attorney Mike Schmidt, who ran as a criminal justice reformer, is on track to lose to Nathan Vasquez, a prosecutor who worked in Schmidt's office and blamed him for high crime rates. On the presidential side, President Biden and former President Trump won party nominations in Kentucky and Oregon. But for Trump, voters in Kentucky continue to show support for Nikki Haley, who took 6% of the vote, with an additional 4% voting uncommitted. Here joining us today is senior staff writer for The Hill and my friend Niall Stanage. Niall, it's great to see you as always. Let's jump right into it. Last night in Fulton County, Fani Willis easily won her Democratic primary, now set to face off with Republican lawyer Courtney Kramer in November. We know that Willis was considered a heavy favorite to win in this race, but could we see her relationship with Nathan Wade, the Trump case in that state, as well as criticism from national Republicans essentially affect her chances?
I don't think it will affect her chances, although that's not to say it is irrelevant. The reason I say it won't affect her chances is Fulton County is Fulton County. It's a Democratic stronghold. In 2020, President Biden got more than 70% of the vote in Fulton County. So that being so, I don't see any realistic possibility of Fani Willis being in trouble, never mind beaten. That being said, the kind of critiques that you're talking about, Julia, obviously are part of the broader political debate, a part of the debate about former President Trump and the cases against him. So those have a salience of a kind, just not one that is likely to affect Fani Willis's re-election.
I want to head out west to California, where Republican Vince Vaughn won a special election to take over former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's seat in office. Vaughn seemed to sweep the special election, but he'll go up against Mike Boudreau this November to win a full term. So who is backing Vaughn, and how did this all but guarantee another win this fall?
Well, I guess the key backer of Mr. Vaughn is former President Trump. He was quite forceful in his endorsement. Obviously, the Trump endorsement matters enormously in Republican primaries. It's interesting, in this one, there was a Trump ally on the other side of the endorsements, Rick Grinnell. Nevertheless, Mr. Fong has won. He will go forward and be back. This election was to serve the remainder of former Speaker McCarthy's term. When it comes to the November election, I think that the partisan tilt of this district is likely to ensure a Republican re-election. It's not quite as Republican as we were just talking about for Democrats in Fulton County, but this district around Bakersfield in California still typically votes around 70% Republican. So that should be safe enough from the GOP's perspective.
Yeah, important to remember that while California is a blue state, there's certainly those red pockets that you mentioned. So going to Capitol Hill, border security is back front and center in the Senate. But months after Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell hailed a bipartisan deal as a huge success, he has turned his back on the bill, saying Biden should use executive action. Niall, how can we see this play out this week once Schumer calls for a vote?
To me, what we're really seeing playing out, Julia, is the transition, which, as you know, happens in election years, from bills that are intended to make legislative progress in some way, to bills that are really part of a messaging process or a messaging effort. The chances of this bill passing are pretty slim. It appears to be an attempt by Senate Majority Leader Schumer to show that Democrats are doing something and to help the Democratic argument that it is Republicans who are the roadblock to progress. Now, of course, Republicans reject that, and it's worth noting that immigration is a much stronger issue electorally for Republicans than for Democrats. So what Schumer is doing, I suspect, is trying or hoping to at least narrow that gap slightly.
Absolutely, hoping to get vulnerable Democrats like John Tester, Sherrod Brown on the record voting for this, saying they were for progress on border security. So we'll see how that pans out. We've been covering Trump a lot in the context of his hush money case, but this time he's not in the headlines for the hush money case wrapping up. Instead, additional classified documents were found inside of his Mar-a-Lago bedroom. The judge in the case has already delayed the case indefinitely while deliberations continue over which documents can be used in the case. Niall, will this cause another major headache for federal prosecutor Jack Smith in trying to move this case forward?
I think he has enough headaches as it is in terms of the judge in this case delaying it almost indefinitely. And of course, that's controversial because the judge in question, Aileen Cannon, is a Trump nominee. He put her on the bench when he was president. The issue here, I think, Julia, is a broader one about how many of the criminal cases we can really see proceed to trial before November's election. The chances of anything beyond the hush money case going to trial seem to be diminishing. And that's a problem for the former president's critics because a lot of people think the hush money trial is the weakest of the four he faces. And certainly in the Mar-a-Lago case, there's an obstruction of justice element to that, which, if the former president's behavior was as alleged in the indictment, seems just textbook obstruction of justice and a very strong case for prosecutors.
Yeah, Republicans have even said that, that documents case is a weaker one for the president. So we'll have to see. Moving over to the House of Representatives, Speaker Mike Johnson is moving forward with an invitation to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address Congress. Now, we know the invite is coming as the International Criminal Court is moving closer to issuing arrest warrants, and the United Nations announced it will no longer be able to provide aid in Gaza due to instability and a lack of supplies. Niall, will Johnson receive bipartisan support from Chuck Schumer on this move? We know that Democrats have been divided on how to approach Israel.
Yeah, and it's still unclear what precisely Senator Schumer is going to do. He has said he is open to an invitation to Benjamin Netanyahu. But of course, being open to something is not the same as endorsing it. It was also, of course, Senator Schumer who gave a very high-profile speech a few months back criticizing Netanyahu's leadership of Israel and suggesting there should be new elections. That, in turn, I think, Julia, is emblematic of the deeper and bitter split within the Democratic Party over this current phase of the conflict. Most Democratic elected officials continue to have a pretty strongly pro-Israel position. But if you look at polls of Democratic voters, the reverse is true. Clearly, the plurality of Democratic voters now have greater sympathy with the Palestinians in the overall conflict.
Well, we'll be watching to see how those elected officials respond to, the idea of an invitation to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu going forward. Niall, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Julia.
34 felony counts and weeks of testimony with over 20 witnesses. Trump's criminal hush money trial is almost over after both the defense and prosecution rested their cases this week. The trial revealed the inner workings of a catch-and-kill scheme meant to stop negative stories about Trump leading into the 2016 election. Adult film star Stormy Daniels was grilled over her alleged sexual encounter with the former president, and Trump's former fixer Michael Cohen, the prosecution's lead witness, admitted under oath to stealing from the Trump Organization, a major blow to the prosecution's case, who tried to paint Cohen as a trustworthy witness who could reveal the inner workings of the hidden hush money payments. Joining me now is my colleague, The Hill's Zach Schonfeld, who's been tirelessly covering this case from inside the courtroom. Zach, thank you so much for joining us. The case seems to be coming to a close with jury deliberations set to start as early as next week. After the jury receives instructions, how fast could we see a verdict?
It could be very fast. Once the jury gets those instructions, they retire to their deliberation room. There are no rules for how short or how long they must take before returning their verdict. So it's all up to the 12 New Yorkers in that deliberation room, whether they need mere minutes, whether they need hours, whether they need days, or whether they need weeks. So we don't know, but what we do know is that the schedule for the end of this trial does seem pretty set in stone, in that closing statements are set for the Tuesday after Memorial Day. And so it does seem pretty set in stone that the jury is either going to begin its deliberations at the end of the day Tuesday, possibly at the start of Wednesday, but it seems that it won't be any later than that.
Well, it's a wait and see portion that we've made it to now. The prosecution has put almost all of its entire case behind Michael Cohen, hoping to use text messages, phone records, and business documents to help support his testimony. But revealing he stole tens of thousands of dollars from the Trump Organization, did we see any initial reaction from jurors? And, was this a surprise to the prosecution?
I think the jurors were paying close attention to all of this testimony, over, not even just Michael Cohen, but across this trial. I haven't seen any jurors fall asleep. They've all been paying attention. They've been looking closely at those text messages, those emails being shown on monitors in front of them. So they've been taking lots of notes. So certainly paying close attention. In terms of whether this was a surprise to the prosecution, I don't think it was entirely a surprise. On direct examination, prosecutors had sort of alluded to this and the fact that Michael Cohen had requested reimbursement from the Trump Organization for much more than he actually had paid out to this tech firm to help boost Trump's poll ratings back in 2016. So he didn't outright say on direct examination, they didn't ask him, oh, so you stole that, quite direct comment didn't come until Trump's lawyers got up there. But I don't think it was any surprise to the prosecution because they sort of started to get into it when they were questioning Cohen last week.
I want to ask you about a relatively dramatic moment that happened in the courthouse this week. Judge Juan Merchan cleared the courtroom after defense witness Robert Costello stared down the judge, threatening to kick him off of the stand. What are legal experts saying about Costello's testimony? And, did this incident do more damage to the defense side?
I don't think the particular incident in terms of clearing the courtroom as abrupt and as striking as it was, I think it's important to remember the jury wasn't there when that happened. So they didn't see any of that happen. They don't even know that Robert Costello was admonished by the judge. What they did see, however, before they left the room is they did see a little bit of what I would call an attitude from the witness, making comments and objections that were being sustained that he didn't like. He was making reactions to the questions from prosecutors as well. So I think especially, there are two lawyers who are sitting on this jury. And so I think they especially were seemed a little bit taken aback by that moment. But in terms of the actual, that striking incident where dozens of reporters were abruptly ushered out of the courtroom all of a sudden, the jury has no idea that happened.
Yeah. So I want to take a step back at these 34 charges. Can you help us break them down? We know it's centered around hush money payments, but for Trump to be found guilty, will only one of these charges need to stick?
So each of these 34 counts, they each correspond to a document. So after Michael Cohen paid porn star Stormy Daniels $130,000 just before the 2016 election, these 34 documents were all generated as Trump repaid Cohen. There are a series of invoices that Cohen had sent in, general ledger entries, and then the actual checks that were used to pay Cohen. So in theory, it is possible that the jury returns a verdict in which they say, some of these documents were falsified, but some of the other ones were not. So we're going to find him guilty on some counts, acquit him on other counts. But simply just the way that the presentation of evidence has gone in this case, there's not a whole lot of distinction between these different documents. So, I do think there's a good chance that this is going to be all or nothing. But if, that theoretical possibility happens where we get a mixed verdict, even just a conviction on one count would still make Donald Trump a convicted felon heading into the 2024 election.
So on that point, we know this case was set in front of a jury, so defense attorneys need to sway just one juror into doubting these charges. What's the possibility of that happening?
Generally speaking, a hung jury is not very common. It's not very normal. But of course, this is not a normal case. And so, there's a lot of extra considerations that, you got to take into account here. And that is really the Trump strategy, not necessarily getting all 12 jurors to agree to acquit Donald Trump, but just looking for one juror who can be a holdout in that deliberation room, who could potentially, fend off a guilty verdict because all 12 jurors must unanimously agree to come to a verdict. And that one holdout would be particularly important because in theory, if there is a hung jury, a mistrial would be declared and prosecutors can attempt to retry Donald Trump. But, the time is ticking before the election. So it does seem that if there's a hung jury, it's doubtful that this case could be retried for the election. And that's everything. Because, as we've been talking about, even just a conviction on one count would make Donald Trump a convicted felon and could potentially carry jail time.
Yeah, so that's what I finally wanted to ask you about. We know that the million-dollar question everyone wants to know is, could Trump, a former president who's running for president again, actually end up going to jail on these charges?
He could, if he is convicted on these 34 counts. They are felonies. They do carry a maximum of a few years in jail. That being said, it's unlikely that he would go to jail because most first-time offenders who have been convicted on these charges are sentenced to something less. So, for example, a fine. But it is possible. There have been defendants, first-time offenders in the past who have gone to jail for very short periods of time. But like I said, it would be unusual for a first-time offender like Donald Trump.
I say it all the time, and I know it's a cliche, but this case and just this year, I don't know, these last 8 years, so unprecedented. So Zach, thank you so much for helping us break it down.
Good to be with you, Julia.
Thanks. Texas Senator Ted Cruz is facing skepticism this week after he introduced a bill to protect in vitro fertilization. The staunchly anti-abortion senator joined forces with Alabama Senator Katie Britt to introduce the bill. Democratic challenger Colin Allred is now accusing Cruz of covering up his record on reproductive health. It comes after Alabama's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are considered children, and IVF clinics in the state shuttered. Cruz has not indicated if he agrees with that Alabama ruling. 4 Democratic senators introduced a similar bill shortly after the ruling. That bill has not passed the Senate. 45 House and Senate Democrats are accusing Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito of bias after a report showed an American flag flown upside down at his home just after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. The upside-down flag became a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement in the weeks after President Biden's victory in the 2020 election. In a letter Tuesday, the group of congressional Democrats urged Alito to recuse himself from all pending January 6th-related cases. Alito has blamed the flag on a spat his wife had with his neighbor. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.